After a year or two, or even more abroad, you find that not only have you gained some incredible experience, but you've also fallen in love and gained a partner or spouse from your new home. The two of you have decided to return to Canada, and now comes the fun part. Assuming that your new partner is a foreign national to Canada, you will now need to deal with a complex and potentially confusing Canadian immigration process. In this series, we ask one of Canada's most respected immigration lawyers some of the questions that are often on people's minds. It gives me great pleasure to welcome Marina Sedai. Marina's firm, Sedai Law, is based out of Surrey, BC. She has been practicing immigration law exclusively since 2005 and is a past national chair of the Canadian Bar Association's immigration section. She joins me in this series answering questions about the process of bringing a foreign national partner or spouse back to Canada. Marina, once again, thank you for joining us for the 5th installment in this series.
Thank you for having me. I'm glad to be back.
So we spoke about in previous episodes about arriving in Canada and the possibility of work. In this episode, we're going to talk about children and mistakes. That's not the same thing. The children are not the mistakes.
Unrelated.
They're
yes.
unrelated. How do children become permanent residents or citizens? And this is assuming that they are perhaps children from another marriage of the foreign national spouse.
Right. So, interestingly, this is rare, but it does happen. I always inquire as to where the parents were born and the grandparents were born, if their grandparents born in Canada, if they are members of the foreign service or military. So, 1 out of 500 times we might get a surprise that the children actually have a claim to Canadian citizenship. But putting aside those rare cases, if the children are foreign nationals, they are not Canadian citizens by virtue to being born in Canada or being born outside Canada to a Canadian parent and being born outside Canada in the first generation. Then they're foreign nationals, just like their parent who's immigrating. They will immigrate along with their parent as dependents on the parent's application. So they are automatically to be part of that process. And very important, it just breaks my heart because sometimes I hear people getting horrible advice to not include the children on the application. Let's say that they're not going to immigrate with the parent right away. That is, if anybody ever advises any of the viewers of that, they should know to run in the opposite direction because that can create serious problems later. So children should always be identified on an application, whether they're coming or they're not coming. But to get those children here, they will presumably enter with the parent, or if they have to enter later than the parent, let's say the permanent resident application is approved and that foreign national parent is coming and the children are to come later, that's fine too. I mean, once you get legal advice on the exact timing of that, but they can be landed later if their document permits, their landing document permits. But the principal applicant, the parent, has to be landed as a permanent resident first. So now an interesting thing is that sometimes children will not be eligible for citizenship for some reason. Maybe they're the second generation born outside Canada. So because they are the legal child of the Canadian sponsor. So they're going to immigrate with the foreign national spouse. But as soon as they get here as a permanent resident, they can immediately apply for citizenship. So sometimes that's worth investigating as well. They won't have to wait for citizenship the way their foreign national parent will need to wait a few years for citizenship.
Interesting. I'm curious about some of the mistakes that are common in applications.
Yes. Okay, so I touched on one, and that is, and it's a big issue not identifying someone in the application, a family member who should be identified. It doesn't matter if the child is in custody of another spouse. It doesn't matter if one doesn't have any relationship with that child, and so they think, I've never even met this child. They must be listed. If they're not, that is a misrepresentation by omission. Misrepresentations, it's serious stuff, and the Canadian government is beginning to find misrepresentation far, far more often, and the consequences are serious. It's usually a refusal of the application and a 5-year bar on even applying to come to Canada as a temporary resident or a permanent resident. And then even when one can apply, they have this arguably prejudicial history, immigration history, that they have to fight against. So getting all family members on, getting all information on the application. It really, when people are dealing with paperwork, they're like, well, what's the level of care here? I mean, if I just basically get the information down, is that good enough? No, the officer will closely examine the information, drilling down on it, making sure it all, did somebody say they're going to school in a city here, but they show that they were living in a small town that's 5 hours away? How can that be? So they will go through that. All of that background information goes to not only the officer, of course, but it goes to CSIS, Canada's spy agency, and it's used to perform background checks. So they're very fussed about that. Leave no gaps. So accurate information, complete information. And I want to stick with misrepresentation for a moment, because we all know misrepresentation is, giving incorrect information to purposefully mislead someone, lying, right? Most people, in 15 years, it's been extremely rare for me to encounter somebody who has a thought that they might like to lie. But it's also on the other end of the spectrum, innocently not putting in information that should be in there. Sometimes people really don't know. And that can lead to the same result as though they meant to lie. So it's really important to be quite particular. Other mistakes that are made is not following the checklist. Those checklists that are used to prepare the application, they're golden. The officers and the intake staff, when they arrive at the processing office, pay very close attention to them. Read the small print. Make sure that you have not only the document that they're asking for, but it has the format that they want it in. There are other issues as well when it comes to filling out the forms. One can read many of these questions and they think, well, this is straightforward. I can answer this myself. And most of the questions, absolutely, that's true. Some of them are not clear in their intent. So one example, and there are many in an application, but I think this is the best one. At the beginning of one of the forms, it says, if the sponsor is found ineligible to sponsor, do you want us to just stop processing everything and give you back your money? Well, most people are going to say, well, yes, because if there isn't a sponsor, the whole application's failing, so give me back my money. That is a mistake. One actually wants to say, click the box that says, no, even if the sponsor is ineligible, continue on with processing. Because then when the permanent resident application is refused, if it's an outside of Canada application, they might have an appeal against that. Or if there's no appeal, such as in the inside of Canada process, they might have access to a judicial review. That's available in some cases, not all. So sometimes the intention behind the questions rather are unclear. And I'll add one more. There is something called the statutory questions. And this is where, it's the small print at the end of the forms. And it's tiny print and it has check boxes, yes or no, and then a box to explain. And it starts off by asking, some questions that people are going to go, oh, no, this isn't going to apply to me. Have you ever participated in war crimes kind of a question. But read those questions very slowly and answer them correctly, because a big problem is that people are not understanding some of the questions and then they don't answer them right, especially if the one that asks, have you been refused an application or a visa or wording to that effect in any country in the world. And so they think, oh, they don't answer it properly, and Canada gets information from other countries and they go, aha, your visa to the United States was refused 10 years ago. Your application is refused and we find you guilty of misrepresentation. So some of the questions are tricky, but my best advice on all of them is read them slowly and read every word.
Interesting. Marina, once again, thank you so much for this advice.
My pleasure. Thank you.
And thank you for watching. If your questions are a bit more specific or perhaps complex, Sedai Law would love to hear from you. They're there to help. Make sure that you mention that you watched this episode. Their contact info is in the description. This is a series about immigration and is published every Thursday. Make sure that you like this video and subscribe so that you don't miss out on any episodes. Until next time.